during that first debate, he was stumbling, he was forgetting what he was saying, it might sound familiar, and you really wanted him to go for that second round. And what happened in that debate really maybe changed the course of the outcome, because you may recall this line, right, where his age keeps being brought up. He was 73 at the time. He was the oldest candidate running for office of president at the time. And so when the moderator started to ask him, you know, how capable are you? How tired will you be? President Kennedy lost sleep oftentimes during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he had that mic drop moment. So I'm going to have you guys hear what he said. I'm sure you'll remember. I will not make age an issue in this campaign. I'm not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience. And everyone, including Walter Mondale, laughed. And he even said later that he felt he lost that presidential election because of that moment.
Well, it turned it around. And actually, we had already turned it around, and a few days before, we had a great whistle-stop campaign on October 12th going through southern Ohio. But we were dealing with the age issue, and Henry Truitt, the reporter, brought that up because Reagan hadn't done well in the first debate, October 7th in Louisville. It's interesting how, I can't remember what I had for breakfast today, but I can remember dates in the campaign. And October 7th was the debate in Louisville. But when he asked that question regarding Reagan's age, by the way, Reagan came up with that himself. People asked me, did you write that form? Or did people write that form? That came out of, Reagan had thought of that. He knew he was going to be asked about something about his age at some point, and he probably had stored that away. Maybe he came out from some movie he had watched 40 years ago, or whatever. But he had that stored away in his brain, and his timing was impeccable. But I think we had set the stage for that in that whistle-stop campaign, and then when he did that, it was a zinger, and with Mondale's reaction, he did put it away.
It is often the zingers and those memorable moments that get played over and over again, especially with television. And so we also think about Nixon, right? President Nixon talked to you often when it came to debates when you were preparing Reagan that it didn't matter so much the facts and what was being said as much as the demeanor and if the candidate looked presidential, which is very interesting considering the fact that the very first televised debate with Nixon and Kennedy also did not go very well for President Nixon because he didn't want to wear makeup, he wore this drab gray suit, matched the background, he didn't stand out, he was sweating. So for his experience, he came to realize how important demeanor and appearance was.
Right. President Nixon sort of learned his lesson, and then, and by the way, in that first debate, he had an infection. He'd hit his knee coming out of the car a few days earlier, and he had an infection, bacterial infection, and so that was part of it. They had told him about his sweating, that he was nervous. Well, he was sweating because he had the infection in any event. And then he, instead of makeup, he used something called beard stick. And they didn't have very sophisticated lighting back in 1960, so it had a very heavy dark shadow on his beard. But in any event, he won in the radio audience, and he lost in the TV audience. So he had learned by then that the appearances were very important. And so in the memo, in the back of the book in the appendix, which is something very important in this book, there are two memos that have never been made public before that are in the appendix of this book. That were secret memos that Nixon wrote to then Governor Reagan, candidate Reagan, that he used me as a secret courier, and he gave those memos to me to give to Reagan during the campaign. And in those memos, he gave Reagan secret advice on communication, and in one of those memos were advice on the debate, and I think that's part of what Roxy is referring to.
Yes, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about your role as that secret agent, so to speak, coming up. But let's back up a little bit and really just talk about the fact that as a kid growing up in a little town of Visalia, right, in a farm town, how you went from there to UCSB to law school at Columbia, and ended up basically playing such a pivotal role and being part of such an important part of history. How did that happen? How did that little boy go from Visalia to the White House? And why you were such a political junkie? Where did that begin?
Well, a lot of it's fate, but it probably began in something called Boys State, which is sponsored by the American Legion back in the 60s. I think it still takes place. And I was 16 years old and went to Boys State. It was a experiment in civic government, and you actually ran for office. And you went to Sacramento, and you stayed at the fairgrounds. And I actually ran for, you get to run for Assembly, Senate, and state offices, and I ran for state controller. Actually, got a picture taken, and Mike, you would appreciate this, with Alan Cranston. I still have a picture of Alan Cranston, terrible left-winger. It's a black and white picture I have somewhere, and he signed it. So, in any event, I always liked the idea of running for some kind of office. I ran for office in high school, class president. And then when I got to Santa Barbara, I was on the debate team. So I guess I love to argue and debate. And as a freshman, I got to meet Nixon when one of my debate colleagues said Nixon was going to be campaigning for governor over to San Marcos High School in Santa Barbara. So we went over to see him and cornered him afterwards, and he gave us a couple of debate pointers about, and he said, here's a lesson I learned in '60, so here's some debate ideas. And then I ran for office in Santa Barbara. I was student body president, and one of the privileges of being student body president, you got to invite, introduce speakers on campus, like William Buckley and James Farmer. And one of the speakers was when Reagan was campaigning for governor, he came to Santa Barbara as well. And I got the local GOP to bring him over to campus, and I got to introduce them. So the two people I ended up working for president, I got to be Santa Barbara. Reagan, I got to actually introduce on campus. But what it was is that when I went from UCSB to Columbia, I got actually a little bit bored with law school. So when I was looking for something to do, I got interested in the presidential campaign. Nixon was running for office. And nobody else, not literally nobody else, but few people were actually breaking down the doors to work for Nixon back then. And I saw an article in the paper that he was running for president again. Most people were enamored of George Romney and Nelson Rockefeller and even Ronald Reagan, but few were like Nixon. So I saw an opportunity to work for a presidential candidate, wrote a letter to his office, to Mr. Nixon. And at first he didn't reply back, so I wrote another one. I had a carbon copy. Anybody here remember carbon copies? Roxy doesn't remember. She's heard of typewriters too, probably. Yeah. Anyway, so I had the carbon copy, rewrote the letter. My wife worked on Wall Street, so she could hand deliver it to his office on Wall Street. And I got a letter back from Pat Buchanan. And Pat Buchanan came in, asked me to come in for an interview. Came in for an interview, and then asked me, told me I could come in and start working as a volunteer. Worked as a volunteer. And then got hired that summer to work in the campaign to work for Alan Greenspan, who was the head of the domestic policy. And then when we won the election, I still had to go back and pass the bar in California. Then I came back and started working at the White House. That's the long version of how I got it.
I love this because not only does it teach the younger generation, you got to start at the bottom and work your way up. I know it's a crazy concept, So many people are in a hurry to jump ahead of everything. And also, obviously you're gifted, obviously you're intelligent, but it takes timing, opportunity, determination, not taking no for an answer. All of those things combined led you to where you ended up.
And to be Jarvie.
Yes, Jarvie, of course.
One lesson in life that, one of the many that Dad taught me, but Dad always said to me, because he had to scrap for food. When he was basically an orphan in Damascus during the genocide, he had to scrap for food, and he said, "Son, you always have to be Jarvie." And so that was one of the things that he taught me. And so you had to be persistent, clever, and resourceful.
Resourceful, flexible. I realize there's some people here who don't speak Armenian, so yes, that's what that means, and you did that well. So this quote really caught my attention. It's the beginning of chapter 16. For those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, it starts with Ken's view of what staff is like in the White House, or just the culture and the toxicity that exists in politics. You wrote this giant paragraph. I'm going to only read one sentence, and then I'll ask you what it is that you like about politics. White House insiders are unmatched in their ability to claim credit, deflect blame, destroy potential rivals, hide information from the president, leak their preferred narrative to the media with such skill that they build their own mini administration. If that's what politics is like, what is it about politics that drew you and kept you there?
Well, politics and government attracts strong men and women. And when you think about it, business and entertainment attracts strong men and women. But it's especially dangerous in government because it can have an impact on people's lives, because it can impact policy. And the reason I wrote this chapter in the book is because I didn't intend to write it, but I wrote it because this chapter shows how the use of power and people coming to Washington for the purpose of wielding power had an impact on policy that changed some of the direction of politics in America. And I didn't agree with, and I think the president didn't agree with at the end of the day. And so it was important to write about it to show that how coming to Washington and coming to the center of power in the White House and the Oval Office, having proximity to the Oval Office and the center of power could change your mind, could have sort of a toxic, almost a cult, an effect like a drug that would make people become almost twisted in how they wanted to affect the way they worked and dealt with others in their lives. And so that's what I think she's referring to, and I think it's an interesting chapter of the book. It's a very contentious chapter. It's not, in some ways, it's not an easy read because it's very hard and it's very contentious and it's very difficult on some of my colleagues. So some of whom are still alive, and but it's an honest portrayal of how power can be a very difficult, have a very difficult toxic effect in Washington.
Yes, it just can lead people down a path that you saw many take.
Right.
And they can easily fall for that. It's intoxicating, right? That's exactly what I gained from it. Let's fast forward for a moment and talk about Watergate and President Nixon and how you were one of the few people so loyal to him, and you refused to believe that he should resign. You continued to tell him and to support him in his decision not to do so until he decided that there was no other way. Talk about that. What was it about that time that you felt like you should just stick it out?
Well, for one thing, when you're 29 years old, you have a lot of energy and strength, but At the time, I was one of the members of a small team of people that were assigned to work on the anti-impeachment forces that were being drawn up. The impeachment process was going forward in the summer of 1974 after the Supreme Court said that President Nixon had to turn over tape recordings that had been done that were evidence. And so the House instituted impeachment procedures against him. So there was a small group of us that were going to be part of an impeachment team, and the Chief of Staff, Al Haig, and Ron Ziegler, the press secretary, and Fred Brizard, who was the general counsel, assigned me to be a part of a central group of people. And I thought for pretty much the entire time of the Watergate investigation by the Washington Post and the New York Times and others was very adversarial. But once it got to the previous summer of '73 and the Senate Watergate Committee assigned by, which was started by Ted Kennedy, who was not on President Nixon's Christmas card list, and then the Senate, and then the Watergate prosecution staff, which was headed up by Archibald Cox, who was the head of opposition research for President Jack Kennedy in his campaign against Richard Nixon. And the prosecutors that were brought on were mainly from Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department, had set up pretty much a partisan prosecution team against President Nixon. So I thought this was a partisan effort to get rid of President Nixon from the beginning. So I wanted to fight this to the end. I wanted President Nixon to take this to the House and make the House members stand their ground, make them show their cards, and show some bravery in voting yes or no. And then if the House voted impeachment, for the Senate to have to take a stand. Now, I was the only one that stayed with that position after a very shocking, at that time, shocking tape came out. It suggested that the president may have obstructed justice. At the time, that's what we thought, but then since then, we found out that we misread the tape. But even then, I thought we should do a better job of defending the president and being a better defense operation, and we weren't doing it at the time. And I didn't think we were serving him as well as we should.
Do you feel that President Nixon has been demonized throughout history and people don't really know who he really was, both as a leader and as a man? And if so, who was he?
Oh, I don't think there's any question of that. I think because starting back when he was a congressman, he served on the House American Activities Committee, and he searched out, there was a fellow in the State Department named Alfred Hess, who he helped expose as a communist spy in the State Department, and a lot of people, he was part of the Eastern establishment, and a lot of the leftists in America didn't think he was a communist, and that he was exposed as such, and Nixon ran very tough campaigns against another far leftist in the Senate, Helen Douglas, and so, and then as Dwight Eisenhower's vice president, he was an aggressive campaigner. So he was disliked pretty much throughout his career as an aggressive person, challenging the Eastern establishment, and he just wasn't one of them. And so by the time he had gotten to the presidency, he didn't fit the mold. He didn't quite fit the mold that the Eastern establishment liked, or the liberal press. The press at that time, we only had 3 networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. We had 3 news weeklies, Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News and World Report. And we had 2 major newspapers. And we didn't have any social media. We didn't have any conservative cable networks. So pretty much it was a raid against Nixon. And so, and he had an adversarial Congress in the entire 5.5 years he was in the presidency. It was always a Democratic House and Senate the entire time. And he entered Congress with, he entered the presidency burdened by 540,000 troops in Vietnam that he inherited from Jack Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. So throughout his, the end of his career, he was saddled with all these headwinds. So it was easy to demonize him throughout his early career and through the end of his career, so that by the time he left the presidency, Nixon was, Watergate became a very easy way to put upon him the whatever nomenclature you wanted to put to kick him out of office and say, look, let's be going with this guy.
For time purposes, I'm going to just highlight two things and we'll move on to Reagan. You mentioned you were 29 years old, and I don't know what you guys were doing at 29 years old, but a very different experience right here. And Nixon obviously at that time left office, went to San Clemente. You described how, you know, there's this feeling of the unknown, it's depressing, you have no idea what the future holds, and he taught you a great lesson in not to give up and to keep looking forward and to not lose hope. And that really caught you off guard because you're thinking, this is a guy who just lost everything, but here he is giving me a pep talk. And that was a reflection of who he was as a person. You went to San Clemente with him because his finances were in disarray, there were subpoenas, there was all kinds of things happening, and so you went to help him out, get things in order. Let's talk about speechwriting for a moment. For those who don't understand, obviously times have changed greatly. You did your writing and your research with what you knew and the knowledge you had. You didn't have the internet at your fingertips. You didn't have ChatGPT. You didn't have any of these things. It's a very different world. It's a very different business. You talk about how you would type on a typewriter, use whiteout, and even air dry it on the vents of the airplane, right? How different that was and how challenging it was, because throughout your career, you always had people who always tried to interfere and interject perhaps their own viewpoints, and that is something you never did. You are very adamant in the fact that as a speechwriter, it is not your job to impact policy or to manipulate, shall we say, the script. But that's not the case all the time.
Well, that's one of the, that's what happens. That's part of what chapter 16 alludes to, is that those who have the power also try to impact power. That's one of the things that I allude to in the book about Jim Baker said that when he came to Washington to wield power. And so a lot of people get into the White House that instead of doing their own job, they like to do everybody else's job. Everybody likes to be a speechwriter, and but nobody likes to write speeches from the beginning. They like to edit speeches. So it's like when Father Sarkis or the sermon was on, when you give a sermon, everybody likes to be a critic, right? They like to tell you what's wrong with the sermon, but they don't like to write the sermon. I'm sure you hear that all the time. So that's what it's like when you're speech writing. Mainly, my job as a speechwriter for the president was to reflect whatever he wanted to do in terms of policy. President Reagan wanted to cut taxes and to cut back government, to cut the budget, to cut regulations. If that's what he wanted to do, that's what I was supposed to reflect in his speeches. It wasn't my job to do anything else. It was my job to reflect in the words whatever he wanted to do.
How much editing did he do on your speeches? I know you were tasked with his first inaugural address, and there he edited quite heavily, kindly but heavily. And as time went on, you got into a rhythm and you collaborated differently. But how much of that took time to get to that point?
Well, he was a good writer, so if he had time, he would he would write a lot of his own speeches and edit heavily. If he didn't have time, he would let me do a lot of the writing. So if he was busy and didn't have a lot of time, by the time I had gotten through the campaign and the first few weeks of his presidency, I had gotten in the rhythm, learned the way he spoke, the way he reflected. Then I could write in his voice and in his own rhythm, and he understood that I could write that way. Then he didn't edit very heavily. But
Did you take it personally at first?
No, I did. There was a couple of speeches where I really took it personally because it hurt my feelings. But after a while, I realized that that's not my job. And he's the President of the United States. And every now and then, it bothered me. But you know what he said to me? He said, in Hollywood, I wasn't known as a good script writer, but I was known as a good script doctor. So I figured at the end of the day, he was the President of the United States, and it wasn't my job.
And he was the one giving the speeches, so he had to be comfortable in his own language,
Well,
correct?
it was his name
Yeah,
on it,
right,
you know, not my name on it.
One thing that struck me in your book is the role that Nancy Reagan played. And you say, in order to understand President Reagan's presidency, you have to understand Nancy Reagan's influence. Speak to that.
Well, she was the closest person in the whole world to him. Nobody could come close. He didn't have a lot of close people to him, not even on his staff. Only a handful of his own staff were very close to him. I'd say, I think I was one of the few on this staff that created a bond and a relationship with him and became close, but not even a fraction of as near as Nancy. So Nancy was reflective of him in any sense. So a lot of times when Mrs. Reagan talked to me about something, giving me instructions or telling me or saying something that was wrong or saying something that had to be changed, I knew that she wasn't talking necessarily for her, she was talking for him, because he didn't like to be confrontational. So a lot of times when he wanted something done, he didn't do it himself, he had Nancy do it. And so, I won't run it for you in the book, but there's a beautiful little scene on the airplane, Air Force One, between the President and Nancy and me, and then after Nancy gets through with me, we bring in Jim Baker, and then we take care of Jim Baker.
I think you said every political leader needs a SOB. Right. In referring to her role and what she did. I mean, truly, I think people knew of her influence in his life, but you really get into the details as far as her viewpoint on the State of the Union speech and what should be in it, the RNC speech, right? The language using abortion or whether or not that should be a topic he addresses. This visit to a German cemetery, which leads me perfectly into chapter 20, which is an important chapter for many reasons, including the fact that Ken was truly inspired by visiting the Arlington National Cemetery for Genocide Remembrance Day. So I'll let Ken fill in the details, but basically what happened is President Reagan was invited by the Chancellor to go to visit a German cemetery to mark the 40 years of World War II ending. And everyone was against this visit. People didn't want him to go. And you were called in as the fireman to do some damage control, right? And as you're trying to come up with this speech where he's now going to also go to a concentration camps to kind of take away the heat he was feeling, you went to mark the 70th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. And there, in listening to the prayers and the music and thinking back to your heritage and your childhood, you became inspired and wrote a speech that is described as the greatest speech by Reagan's official biographer. The Times also called it a skillful exercise in both the art of eulogy and political damage control. You saved him with these political stumbles and diplomatic stumbles that he was experiencing. What about that day inspired you?
I was searching for words. He was being accused of being anti-Semitic, and in order to remove this aura over his head, he was to go to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, which was the scene of the Holocaust in Germany. And so I was trying to gather words to show that he was sensitive to the Jewish Holocaust, and I was really struggling to find the proper words to come up with something very poetic and creative that was different, because this had been done so many times. There's so many cliches, and I was working hard at it. And a friend of mine, Jim Rangillian, convinced me to accompany him to. It was around. It wasn't exactly on April 24th. It may have been April 23rd or 22nd. But there was a commemoration ceremony in Arlington to commemorate the Armenian genocide, and so I went with him that day, and so there was a service, and when I heard the choir, and all of a sudden I just, it took me back to my childhood and memories of, as just a young boy, accompanying my parents when they used to visit their friends. Back then, the old folks would visit with each other. They didn't have any other entertainment, so they visited with each other. And the ladies would go in the other room and gossip, and the old man would sit in the other room and talk about the price of the crops and the raisins. Were not the prices were good. They'd be drinking surge, but I could hear the low voices, and I could always hear the word Khachigian. I could always hear that word softly. And that day at Arlington brought back such a searing memory to me that all of a sudden it just awakened in me, and I said, Jim, look, we got to go back right now after the ceremony, and drop me off. And I went to the typewriter, and the words just poured out of my head and into the typewriter. And when I wrote the speech, everybody thought I was talking about the German Holocaust, and when I was writing, I was really talking about the Armenian genocide.
In fact, long before President Biden mentioned the Armenian genocide, in 1981, Ken played a big role in the proclamation that President Reagan put out. It was a statement actually about the Holocaust, but Ken used language which referred to the Armenian genocide. He said, like the genocide of the Armenians before it, and the genocide of the Cambodians which followed it, and like too many other such persecutions of too many other peoples, the lessons of the Holocaust must never be forgotten. Did you, were you nervous or hesitant in putting this into writing at the time, that you would get some pushback? Did that cross your mind?
I was hesitant only because I knew it was controversial, and it was not my, I didn't have the right to make policy, and I was treading in dangerous territory. So I went to first to the Deputy National Security Advisor, Bud Nance, and I knew I shouldn't be doing this on my own, and tried to slip it in. So I asked Bud Nance, and I said, Bud, I want to show you what I'm putting into this proclamation. And I showed him the language, and he said, well, it's true, isn't it? And I said, well, it is. And so then I thought, well, I better check one more source. So Dick Allen was the National Security Advisor, so I thought I'd better check with him. And I said, Dick, it was an old friend of mine, I said, Dick, I'm going to put this in proclamation that's going to go into the president, and I just want to show it to you, about the Armenian genocide. And he said, well, it's true, isn't it? And I said, yes, it's true. And he said, oh, well, it's okay with me. So the main thing is it never got to the State Department. So it went from me, then to the staff secretary, and the staff secretary to the president. Well, I don't think the president ever saw it. They probably just got an auto pen, and then it got signed.
During the time that, however it got done, right?
Yeah.
Being pragmatic
And
here.
the Turks were
A little angry.
very angry.
Yeah. During the time that you were working for Reagan, another thing that Nancy Reagan was complaining about throughout was that you were going back and forth because you hadn't committed to working full-time as staff at the White House. And she always kind of gave you a little bit of a guilt trip about that, that he needed you and you were a trusted face and he felt comfortable with you. But one of the many things you were doing, you were actually a big part of George Khachigian's campaign. He was running to become governor. And you saw some of those pictures in the South John Shore. And that was an important time as well because 3 weeks before the vote, he released his campaign manager, and you had to help out, do a little damage control there, and he ended up winning and became the governor of California.
Right. So that was in 1982, and the campaign manager were George Khachigian, Mike, and Judge DeFries, and Joe Stein, make it tonight? No, anyway. So the campaign manager made a very controversial statement 3 weeks before the election. It was bad enough that we were in deep trouble anyway. And so there was a very confrontational meeting between George and the campaign manager, and he fired him for making this basically ethnic slur against our opponent. And with 3 weeks left, we had no campaign manager, and so we fired our advertising team and all the support mechanism. So I took over as being sort of the chief strategist, and we had another fellow did the administrative. We brought in a new advertising team, and I wrote some of the commercials, and we went out and raised some more. Carl Smillian was our chief fundraiser, and I do have to tell you a story that we did have we were raising money, and this is a fairly interesting story. That there was a fellow named Bill Mosesian who lived way out in nowhere, Arvin, California. He was a farmer, and he was pretty much blind, and I don't know how old Bill was at the time, and we desperately needed money. He was going to contribute $50,000. This was 1982. I don't know how much that is in today's dollars, but Bill Mosesian said he gave us that $50,000. It's legal. That's legal, by the way. $50,000 check, and he said to us, he says, "I remember growing up as a boy, them calling me a dirty Armenian." And he said, "Here's your $50,000 check." And he says, "I hope you make something out of it." And so there was a lot of discrimination against Armenians back in the 30s and 40s. And anyway, Bill Mosesian's $50,000 made a big difference, and we won by just barely. It was, I think, a couple of votes per precinct.
Yeah, that is pretty incredible. I know we're at the 45-minute mark, and I will wrap.
Sorry.
No. It's fascinating, and I'm so glad we have more time together instead of just the segments on television. I will ask you just a couple things here, because you said that your hope and what you hope this book accomplishes is that it encourages the younger generation to perhaps get involved in politics. You said that both you and George Khachigian actually had set a goal to get more younger Armenians involved in politics. They're successful businessmen, they can be successful bureaucrats, But in order to make a difference, you have to make a difference in policy, and you have to get in there. Why do you think that's so important?
Well, you have to get in positions where you can change things, and George was George was one of my role models, and that's how I met him, by the way, is in the 1968 convention. We happened to be on a shuttle bus to the convention together, and he was a state senator, and he and Gloria were sitting up 2 seats ahead of me on the shuttle bus, and I tapped him on the shoulder and introduced myself, and that's how we got acquainted back in 1968. But he was one of my role models growing up, but he was in a position, and when he became governor, he was able to make a lot of changes. He was able to appoint judges, Supreme Court judges, Superior Court judges, put Armenians and others in positions of power to make changes not only judges, but into county fair appointments, and put people in state board of equalization and PUC appointments to really make changes. So young people could see where they could see role models in their lives where there were Armenians that weren't just doing farming or business or other ways to just make money, but in positions where they could change the direction of government, make government better, make government safer. George was very big on making public safety a very big, important issue in his life, and he did make very serious changes. And I was, in my time in government, which is limited, but in my time in government, I like try to help elect people like George, like Dan Lundgren, who was a big, very important pro-public safety, helped elect Pete Wilson, and President Reagan, who helped cut taxes. Those were things that were important to me. So if young Armenian men and women can get into government, they can be in a position to affect policy. And if they get into really important positions today, they might be able to affect international policy towards the government of Turkey or the government of Azerbaijan or something like that, and have some really, really big influence. And that's something I really, really encourage. And if I could be a role model, and if other Armenians reach that level where they could be role models, I could really encourage it.
There's this quote from you that I'm going to read because it really resonated with me, and I think many people here who perhaps are part of the diaspora or Armenian American can relate to this as well. It was in the Armenian Mirror Spectator, and actually Ovnat Derderian alluded to this a little bit, where you're torn between basically two worlds, right? You said, it was interesting growing up. My feet were always half in one culture and half in the other culture growing up. But I'm still active in the Armenian community. And then, on the other hand, I belong to groups that are solely non-Armenian. I still live in two worlds. And it is funny how people view you that way. It's hard. I think that that really hit home for me as well, where you feel like you're this, but you can be that, you're part of this, but you're also part of that. But at the same time, it also makes me realize, and obviously you're a great example of this, of someone who can belong in both worlds and make a difference in both worlds, and those worlds can come together. Thank you for what you've done and what you continue to do, and it's so important that you wrote this book and you're here tonight with so many of us, and I'm going to open this up now for others who I'm sure have many questions for you. We're going to ask people to come up, and there's going to be a mic right there.
This is how we're going to do it. We have the lovely Osana Amron. She's going to be walking. So what we're going to do, before you put your hands up, please, we're going to start from this front section, and she's going to filter to the back. So you raise your hand. So we're starting from the front section. So Osana, this gentleman's first right here.
That's gonna be a tough one.
No, this is gonna be easy. I just wanna say, I went to the Nixon Library and listened to your presentation there. I bought the book, I read the book, and I don't think I've ever read, and I've been a political and history junkie my whole life, but I don't ever think I've read a book where I got so much information and so much insight as provided in your book, and it really changed my mind about some things, especially about Nixon, and rehabilitated him in my mind. So I'd like to thank you for that, and for just sharing all of your insights and your inside information. You took copious notes. So I recommend to everybody to read this book if you're interested in politics, because you won't be disappointed. And I'd like to thank Araxia, because you must have really read the book close, because you picked out a lot of very interesting parts of it and did a very good interview. And I just want to ask Ken one thing.